Thank you to you, Eva Franzen. Now we will move on in our program today. I will introduce Debora Pricila Birgier. She is a senior research fellow at Nordregio. And Maria Bobrinskaya, she is a senior GS analyst. They will take us through understanding at risk of poverty in the Nordic region. They will talk about developmental trends that can be detected with use of AROP in the Nordic region. They will also talk about what gaps exist in the current data and how we can improve monitoring. So welcome, Debora and Maria. I give you the floor.
So thank you, Merethe, for presenting us. What we will do in this presentation is present a part of the second chapter of this report, which tries to give an overview of at risk of poverty of children in the Nordics. As said, it's a co-authored chapter with Maria and with Anna Vanskalenskaya. So the first question that is asked is, what is poverty, and which poverty are we talking about when we talk about poverty? So there are two main approaches to measuring poverty or to discussing poverty. The first one talks about absolute poverty, and that refers to the basic needs that individuals have, and these are survival needs. Whereas the other way to talk about poverty is relative poverty, and this is relative to the standard of living in a specific society. Specifically, when talking about absolute poverty line, these are defined as the minimum resource that the individual needs, including food, shelters, and other clothing. And the most known one is the one used by the World Bank, which gives three thresholds of poverty lines ranging between $2 to $7 per day for individuals. But these are a very, very low level of income that we are talking about, which is not so much relevant to the Nordic situation. So we are looking for other indicators. And some of the statistical bureaus in the Nordics do have a measurement of absolute poverty, but these are not harmonized across the Nordics, and each one of the countries use a different indicators. So then we talk about relative poverty, and this is the most common way to measure poverty. And this is defined in relation to the distribution of income or consumption in a country. And the example is that of using 50 or 60% of the equivalized income in the country. But then there is this debate whether talking about relative poverty is a real poverty in wealthy societies as in the Nordics. And this will be part of what we will discuss in this webinar. In practical terms, what we do in this report is to try to measure poverty specifically using the at-risk of poverty, which we defined as 60 or 50% of the equivalized median income in a country, as we said before. The second one is using material deprivation indicators, which these are indicators which ask individuals, do they have access to several needs or items that are defined as necessary in a specific society. And this gives a more wider view of hardship. The last one is AROP, which refers to at risk of poverty and social inclusion. And this combined the two indicators that I mentioned a moment ago, the relative poverty, at risk of poverty, material deprivation, and also the extent of work intensity of a family. But again, child poverty is measured at the household level, and this is very important to note because children do not have access to their own income. So when we are talking about child poverty, we are talking about children growing in a household that is at risk of poverty. And this is adjusted for the household size and the composition.
If we look at the historic overview of the at-risk of poverty rate for full population, which is 60% of median equalized income, we can see that Nordic countries are doing much better than the average EU. So for the Nordics, the rates are spanning around 11–12%, while for the European Union, it's above 16%. At the same time, if we look, for example, at Sweden, we can see that the at-risk of poverty rate has been growing here since 2018 and peaking at 2019 when it's actually exceeded the average European level. And then it's sort of stabilized somewhere close to the European level. It is also important not to look only at the full population, but also how these risks are spread across different age groups. And what we can see here is that, for example, in Denmark, Finland, and Norway, the risks are somewhat similar across all age groups. But in Sweden and Iceland, we can see a totally different picture. For example, children that are less than 6 years old are the leading group with highest risks, and in Sweden it's more than 20%. The same is relevant for young people younger than 18 years old. They are also at higher risks, and both of them are higher than total population poverty rate for Sweden and Iceland. If we now go back to historic overview, but focus only on children and young people less than 18 years old, we can see that the trend is somewhat similar to full population. The European average is still significantly higher than average Nordic level. It is around 20%. But the same as we spoke for full population is relevant for Sweden, and it's even more vivid here. We can see that the trend is started to grow in 2018, and it peaked in 2019, where it again exceeded a European average, and then stabilized. But we can also say something similar about Norway. The rate is lower than in Sweden, but it also started to grow in 2014, peaked in 2021, and then stabilized somewhere around 14%. When we look at the map of the Nordic region, we can see that there are actually a lot of regional gaps with at risk of poverty for children. For example, Finland has the lowest rate for within the Nordics, but in some rural municipalities it exceeds 25%. And it is somewhat similar to Norway as well, though the average national level is higher than in Finland. We can also see a few municipalities that exceed even 30% at risk of poverty rate for children. But Sweden, for example, has a totally different picture. First of all, it has the highest rate across the Nordics. AROP here is almost 20%. And at the same time, 17% of municipalities in Sweden have registered the rate of at risk of poverty for children higher than 25%. And for all the Nordic countries, we can see a similar trend that rural areas with lower education attainment faced higher child poverty.
So now looking at the effect of household composition, or how these differ across household type. What you see here, the black line is the overall total population, and then we see the situation of household with children, and we see that overall in the Nordics, household with children do not suffer from higher risks of poverty relative to the total population. And when we focus specifically on household with one or two children with two parents, we see that these groups have lower risk of poverty relative to all household with children. But there are two groups that have a different situation. The first one is a household with 3 or more children, and specifically in Sweden, and to some extent also in Norway, we see that this group have higher risk of poverty relative to other households with children and relative to a household with less children. The other group that stand out is that of single parents, and we see that in all the Nordics, as well as in the EU, children growing up with single parents stand out as a group that have the highest risk of poverty when measured at AROP. Even when we use a different indicator, and specifically looking at a material and social deprivation rate, we also see here that while the overall rate of risk of material deprivation are lower for all the Nordics, and there is differences in the ranking across the Nordic when using this indicator, still the group of children growing up with single parents stand up as a group which has higher deprivation in terms of material deprivation. looking at labor market attachment and the connection and the association with poverty, what we see here is a risk of poverty based on different level of work intensity of the household heads. And we see that as individuals have higher connection to the labor market, or very high work intensity, the risk of poverty are very low, this blue dark line. Whereas when households have very low work intensity, the risk of poverty are substantially higher. And this the connection between labor market attachment and the risk of poverty differs somewhat across the Nordics, because we see that, for example, in Sweden, households with low work intensity and very low work intensity have substantially higher risk of poverty, whereas the situation is somewhat more mitigated in the other Nordic countries, such as Denmark, Finland, and to some extent also Iceland. So this is standing out as the association between labor market attachment and risk of poverty. The second aspect that we talk in the report is that of educational attainment and of the household head and association with risk of poverty using the same indicators. And what we see, again, is that individual or children growing up in a household with low level of education of their parents have substantially higher risk of poverty compared to children growing up with more educated family. And this association is much more strong, or is much more evident in the case of Sweden and Norway, in which more than 45% of children growing up in households with lower level of education of their parents are at risk of poverty compared to lower levels in the other Nordics. Lastly, in the report, we also bring up the connection between a risk of poverty and a migration status. And the Eurostat have information about the risk of poverty of children growing up based on the place of birth of their parents and the citizenship of their parents. And you see these two indicators. So the dark blue and the red blue represent children growing up either with parents that are not citizens or with parents that are foreign born. And we see that these groups have substantially higher risk of growing up in poverty, at risk of poverty, relative to children which their parents are native born or have a citizens of the country of destination.
So summing up some key of our findings in this study, we can say that overall trends for the Nordics are as follows. Nordic countries have low child poverty rates compared to European average, but if measuring using AROP, Sweden and Norway rates are on the rise. And at the same time, we can see that there are a lot of regional disparities. For example, some municipalities where these rates exceed even 25% in Sweden and Finland, and these would be mainly rural municipalities. If we focus on specific groups that are at higher risks, of course, it's primarily households that are with single parents, large families, families with a migrant background. And we think that in order to, for the countries to mitigate those risks, they could focus on targeted social support, working on better accessibility of labor market and education, and some tailored integration programs and policies for immigrant families. For future directions and how this monitoring of child poverty could be improved, we suggest that cross-national collaboration and in longitude research across the Nordic countries and as well data sharing on well-being of children and young people could be crucial for further research. And besides that, it is also important to have a harmonized approach for indicators on poverty rates for children and for full population as well across the Nordic countries. Like Debora mentioned before, for example, for absolute poverty, there is no unified definition that we could use for the Nordic, for all of the Nordic countries. Those that have it differently, and some of the countries don't have it at all. And moreover, we think that for the Nordic countries, it is also important to have some more specific indicators on child poverty and well-being for children. Thank you.
Our next speaker is sending from the studio of the research institution Fafo in Oslo, Norway. Tone Fløtten is a senior researcher in sociology and has extensive experience in welfare research. She will give us some Nordic perspectives on the risks of child poverty, and she will talk about how economic disparity affects social cohesion and long-term sustainability in the Nordic region. And she will also say something about policies and what kind of policies who are regarded more effective or less effective at reducing the risk of child poverty and also increasing social inclusion for children and youth. Welcome, Tone Fløtten. We look forward to hear from you.
At a meeting at the International Council of Social Welfare in 1979, the Norwegian Prime Minister, Odvar Nordli, here sitting together with his Nordic colleague, stated the following: "We have reached our main target. For the first time in this country's history and in the other Nordic countries, we can definitely say that poverty and social distress have been eradicated. Historically speaking, this accomplishment is remarkable," Odvar Nordli said. Still, here we are, 45 years later, discussing child poverty in the Nordics. Why so? What happened? Well, first and foremost, the Nordic politicians did not think of poverty the way we do today. What they had in mind was poverty expressed through deep social distress as it was in the 1930s. At that time, poverty was characterized by people living in slums-like conditions and lacking essential necessities. The politicians did not consider poverty a relative phenomenon as we do now. And Nordli's speech is also an expression of optimism on behalf of the success of the Nordic model. In the late 1970s, the Nordic countries had developed into stable, generous welfare states, and the model's success has proven to be remarkably resilient. The Nordic countries are still doing well in international comparisons on economy and welfare. It is not difficult to find books and articles where the Nordic success is highlighted. People often point to things like low inequality, high levels of education, and the fact that most people are part of the labor force. And the poverty levels have traditionally been low. I cannot show how the Nordics do along all dimensions. But given the subject of our seminar, it is relevant to illustrate by a chart of child poverty. This was the situation in 2023 when it comes to the share of children living in families with incomes below the risk of poverty line. The average European rate was above 19%. The corresponding rate in Denmark, Norway, and Finland, Denmark, Iceland, and Finland was below 10%. The Norwegian rate a bit higher, about 12%. And it is Sweden that is the Nordic outlier, with almost 20% of the children falling below the risk of poverty threshold. So why then, when the Nordic countries in general, with the exception of Sweden maybe, do well along many dimensions, including a relatively low number of children going up under severe material distress, why do we worry about child poverty to the extent that we actually do? Let me give you at least 3 important reasons for this. First, we are worried because child poverty rates have increased also in times of economic growth. This is a chart from Eurostat showing the development between 2004 and 2024. The chart shows that the Nordic countries have developed somewhat differently. The share of children living in families with incomes below the EU risk of poverty line has been relatively stable in Finland and Denmark. It has risen and decreased in Norway, and the growth is especially high in Sweden. Also, UNICEF have noted the development in the Nordics in the 2023 report on child poverty. In this report, the countries were ranged after a combination of the poverty measures in 2012 to 2014 and the country's success in reducing poverty in the coming years. While we are used to see most of the Nordic countries doing quite well, This way of measuring showed that we weren't at the top end at all. While Denmark had the lowest rate of child poverty in 2023, the country fell to 15th place in this ranking because child poverty had increased over the past decade. Finland dropped from 3rd to 14th place because the country had not succeeded in reducing child poverty. Norway, Sweden, and Iceland are even further down on the list. So, the Nordics still have relatively low poverty rates, but the development is not as good as we would want it to be. The second reason why we worry so much about child poverty is that some groups are especially vulnerable, and that many of the families with low income has complex problems which it is difficult to detangle. Children from immigrant families are far more likely than other children to experience low income, as an example. In a study by Statistics Norway, it was found that in particularly Sweden and Norway have a large share of children with an immigrant background in the bottom of the income distribution. In Sweden, this applies to 3 out of 4 children, and in Norway, about 1 or 2. In Finland, by contrast, only 21% of the children at the bottom of the income distribution have an immigrant background. Other vulnerable groups are children with single parents, children in large families, and children whose parents have low education. The important underlying factor here is the parents' relation to the labour market, or maybe the lack of relation to the labour market. And what we worry about are these negative cycles where kids inherit their families' poor economic conditions. So we are concerned with child poverty because it's rising, or at least not declining, and we are concerned because some groups are particularly hard hit and because many of them face complex and interconnected challenges. The third reason why the Nordics are much more concerned with child poverty now than they were 2 decades ago is the growing knowledge of how low income can affect children's lives. The Nordic government did in 2022 appoint an expert group that, amongst others, summarized research on the possible effects of child poverty. According to the review of knowledge presented in the report, growing up in a poor family is associated with lower participation in kindergartens and leisure time activities, poor housing conditions, poor school results, lower educational level, and poor health. I deliberately used the word associated with negative outcomes, and I do so because it is an important question to what extent low family income in itself causes these outcomes, or whether the association are due to other underlying factors. In many cases, it is hard to say for sure. But in the literature review, the expert group did, however, find studies that isolated the effect of income. Some studies do, for instance, establish that increasing family income improved the school results for kids from poor families, and it reduced the dropout rates. Other studies concluded that there is a slight improvement in some health indicators if the income increases, and that goes for both physical and psychological health. And our only concern is not only the possible negative effects of child poverty during childhood. We are also concerned with how living in a poor family may affect a person's life chances. The scientific evidence indicates the following. Growing up in a poor family can contribute to the persistence of low status across generations. This is because low income in the family is associated with weaker educational attainment and poor health outcomes that limit children's opportunities in the labour market. However, the positive news are that the economic improvements for low-income families can help break this cycle to some extent. The effects are not massive. Poverty reduction alone will not eliminate all inequalities, but they are real. And again, in countries like the Nordic, where a broader social safety net exists, the income effects are likely to be more muted than in countries without such welfare systems. So far, I have talked about the individual consequences of growing up under economic distress. Obviously, this is only part of the story. The association between child poverty and negative outcomes related to education, health, social integration, and labour force participation does also constitute society challenges. So the question to be asked is, how may poverty affect the social and economic long-term sustainability of the Nordics? The Nordic countries are often highlighted as example societies with a high degree of social cohesion. Social cohesion simply refers to how strong the bonds are between people in a society. We are seen to have strong social ties for several reasons. We tend to have high levels of trust, not just in one another, but also in our public institutions. Of course, there are political disagreements in our countries, but overall, our politics is grounded in a shared set of fundamental values. For instance, it is not surprising that in the Nordic countries, very few would be eager to adopt the American approach to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Quite the opposite. Here, inclusion and equality have long been central political goals in their own right. To preserve social cohesion in a society, many scholars point to the importance of keeping inequalities from growing too large, and to ensure that as many people as possible are included in the working life and in society more broadly. Inclusion and equality is positive for both trust levels and for political stability. Exactly how much inequality or how much social exclusion a society can withstand without undermining cohesion is, of course, impossible to say. But it's fair to state that rising child poverty, combined with a situation where some children, as minority children, are much more likely to face economic hardship, represents a serious challenge to our countries. Child poverty also poses a challenge to long-term economic stability. As I've said, economic hardship during childhood is associated with lower education attainment, poorer schooling performance, and worse health outcomes. Because of this, children from poor families are also a greater risk than others of having an unstable relationship with the labour market later in life. And by unstable relationship, I mean, for example, that people move in and out of the labour market, they work only little, or they earn low wages. For society, this means two things. First, it means reduced tax revenues. And second, it means higher welfare expenditures, whether through increased spending or benefits and social assistance, or through the cost of services aimed at helping people into work. It is difficult to determine exactly what child poverty costs a society, but there have been attempts to estimate the cost of social exclusion. So let me refer to a report by Oslo Economics just to illuminate the possible cost level. In 2021, Oslo Economics conducted an analysis showing that marginalization and exclusion among children and young people resulted in societal costs of approximately 73 billion Norwegian crowns per year. This figure includes, amongst others, lost productivity due to reduced labor income, tax financing cost-related to benefit transfers, and welfare losses due to reduced life expectancy and poor health. And in addition to the costs that have been monetized, the report also highlights significant non-monetized consequences, such as welfare losses from poor health and quality of life, increased costs reduced to crime, and reduced democratic and social participation. Please mark that the social exclusion is not operationalized by poverty in this report, but by school dropouts. And social exclusion is and marginalization is operationalized by being outside the labour market. But both these situations are, however, more prevalent for children from low-income families, so there is no doubt that limiting child poverty is also beneficial for society. So how do we go about to do that? That is, of course, what we in Norway refer to as a 1,000 kroners question. And unfortunately, I do not have the answer to you. There is no simple solution and no single measure that can solve the problem of child poverty. But we must remember that Nordic politics actually work. To put it very simply, the Nordic countries have a long tradition of setting ambitious political goals to assure a good standard of living for the entire population. Health and education institutions have been designed to give everyone the same opportunities to participate in society and working life. Institutions like coordinated wage bargaining have helped create a compressed wage structure. We have strong actors in the political system and in the labour market who are willing to negotiate to reach compromises in order to create good redistributive policies. We have measures such as welfare benefits and the tax system that helps even out of differences created in the labour market. And as a result, the Nordic countries have lower income inequality and lower poverty rates compared to most other countries, and Sweden is maybe turning into an exception here. But still, there is work to do. If we want to reduce child poverty, family incomes must go up. This is because we do measure poverty by family income, so unless the income rises, the poverty level will not decrease. And the best path to higher income is through work. It benefits the individual and it benefits society. On one side, all measures that help parents enter the workforce must be top priorities. Labour market measures, salary subsidy schemes, skills development and lifelong learning are on the list of measures. On the other side, all efforts that strengthen children's chances of completing their education and moving into employment are vital. This is what we call social investment policies. There are a great number of measures in our countries aimed at helping as many children as possible through the education system. These efforts are constantly being developed and refined. I'm not in a position to single out any of these measures as particularly successful, but one finding that is widely acknowledged in international research is this: the earlier you invest in a child's life, the greater the return. But regardless of social investment policies and labour market policies, some people will struggle to enter the workforce no matter what. And for them, welfare benefits are the alternative. At their core, the Nordic welfare benefits are relatively generous. But it's hard to imagine any significant increase going forward. Not only are politicians hesitant, often out of concern that higher benefits might weaken people's work incentives, but we're also facing tough economic times. The costs associated with the aging populations have been on our horizon for years. And right now, increased defense spending and trade tensions are adding to the sense of economic uncertainty. These facts underscore the importance of maximizing labour market participation. But while we wait for improved incomes and lower poverty rates, we need to handle that quite a few children actually grow up in families experiencing severe economic hardship. In the Nordic, these children have access to education and health services, free education and health services, and that is great. But what has been seen as very important also is to assure that young people can participate in peer activities. There is limited research on the effects of children's and young people's participation in leisure time activities. But some studies show that those who take part more actively tend to do better in school and report better mental well-being than their peers. However, it's also here unclear whether it's a result of the participation itself or due to underlying factors. Even though the evidence isn't solid, it's reasonable to assume that having the opportunity to take part in activities is important for children. It is therefore vital to have measures in place that ensure children's participation. At its best, such measures improve children's life chances in the long run. Alternatively, they do at least improve children's living conditions here and now. And it is also here important to pay attention to the most vulnerable groups, as for instance children in immigrant families. We need to have some sort of leave no one behind policy. All in all, it is important, both for society and individuals, that we work to counteract social inequality and poverty. To succeed in this, efforts across many policy areas are absolutely necessary. We need to have a big box of tools and need to use these tools simultaneously. This requires collaboration and coordination across levels and actors. And policy learning, both within countries and across countries or country borders, are useful. The Nordic countries have long traditions of both collaboration and political learning. Let's hope that these traditions can be strengthened and further developed in the efforts to combat inequality and poverty. And in that regard, seminars like this one, initiated by the Nordic Welfare Center, is vital. Thank you for your attention.
Now I will introduce you to our next speaker, Karina Mood. She is a professor in sociology at the Institute of Social Research at Stockholm University and the Institute of Future Studies. She will talk about different measures of poverty, including child-centered measures. Carina Mood, welcome to us. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Merethe. Yes. So I will talk about poverty, conceptual issues, but also show some results. And the research that I'm going to present is done together with two colleagues, Simon Hjalmarsson and Jano Jonsson. And I should also say that some results are preliminary so far. So I'll discuss what poverty is in the Nordics today. And when we discuss poverty in richer countries like the Nordics, we usually focus on social aspects. So we see poverty as a lack of financial resources that makes it difficult to participate in social life on the same terms as others. One can also see it as a standard of living that is below what is acceptable at a given time and place. But of course, some of you will react and say, so these are imprecise definitions. So what are the others that one should live on the same terms as, and what is acceptable? So in order to actually measure poverty in these ways, we need to operationalize it. That is, we need to make it measurable. And how do we do that? Well, we use different kinds of poverty measures. We distinguish different dimensions that say different things. So first, we measure poverty as a direct phenomenon, and that is called deprivation, which I will soon get into. And we can also measure poverty in an indirect way, and then we normally use income-based measures. We can measure poverty in relative terms, that is, what is your situation compared to others, and we can measure poverty in what we call absolute terms. That is not really absolute, I will soon go into that, but it measures if you can afford a fixed basket of things. And we can measure poverty as the family economy or in terms of the family economy, and we can also measure poverty in terms of the individual's own economy. And that can make a big difference, as I will show you very soon. And finally, we can measure poverty cross-sectionally, that is poverty in a given year, and that is what is most common. That's what we mostly see in the newspapers. But we can also measure poverty persistence, that is how poverty persists over several years or a longer period. Those are longitudinal measures. So the direct poverty measures, here we need to ask people about their situation. The most common image of poverty is material deprivation, that is not being able to afford to eat properly, having a low standard of housing, for example, damp and cold, or lacking proper clothing and shoes, etc. That's what most people think about when they think about poverty. And one can also define it as financial deprivation. That means having a limited economy. So you might not have a cash margin in case something happens. You might not have the means to resolve that. It might also be difficulty in paying bills, being delayed with bills, or having difficulties making ends meet. And the advantage of these measures is that they come close to the actual experience of poverty, so the lived experience of what it is to be poor. And it also has a face validity in terms of it's what people think about when you talk about poverty. There are also disadvantages. They can depend not only on low incomes, but also on having a high consumption. So, for example, you can have difficulty paying bills because you simply spend too much and get too many bills. And of course, another disadvantage, if you want to see it as such, is that we have to ask people these questions. We cannot just go to income registers, for example. And here is one example of a direct poverty measure. So here, this is from the Level of Living Survey, 2021. It shows the proportion lacking various goods and services because they cannot afford them. This is the adult population aged 18 to 75. So this is a list of various items, which I would like to point at now, but I cannot really do that. But there is a list of various items. So you have, for example, the possibility to have a vacation 1 week away from home, where you see that almost 9% lack that ability because they cannot afford it. And so on, you go down this list, you can see that we ask people about whether they have a car, and if they don't, is that because they cannot afford it, etc. And usually you define people as poor, directly poor in this way, if they lack a certain number of these items. And if we put that limit at 3 or more of these items, 3% of the population lack so many items or services. And that might sound little, but 3% of the population is not negligible, thinking about how many people that actually corresponds to. So I should say also that this is Sweden. Of course, these are Swedish data, the Swedish level of living survey. So this is an example of a direct poverty measure. And here is another example, financial deprivation. And here we look, we get a historical perspective. So the Swedish level of living survey has been going on. It's actually one of the longest running longitudinal surveys in the world. It has been going on from 1968. So you see below here in the picture, you see the time axis from 68 to 2020, but it's actually 2021. We were planning to do the survey 2020, but COVID happened, so it's actually done in 2021. And then on what we call the y-axis, the axis going up, you see the percentages. And the gray curve, you see we can follow that curve from 68 and on to 2021. And that is the proportion of people lacking a cash margin. And what that is whether you can raise a given sum of money within a week in case you have any unexpected expenses. For example, your car breaks down or a washing machine breaks down or something like that. And in 1968, this was 2,000 Swedish krona, and in 2021, it's 17,000. So we adjust for inflation so that it's a sum corresponding to what you would need for something unexpected that is unusually big but not enormous. So you can see that curve goes down from 68 to 91, and then it has been largely stable but increased a little bit. And from 1991, we also have a curve for having had economic problems, difficulty paying for food and housing and bills. And there we see first an increase and then a decrease up until 2021. So here is one way of attacking the measurement of poverty, direct poverty measures. And another kind of direct poverty measure is asking parents about themselves, but also about their children. So here we have child material deprivation reported from EU Silk, which is done in several European countries. And here we can get an international instead of a historical perspective. So what you see here are the countries taking part in EU Silk, and you have here the list of items, 17 items, and then at the other side you have the percentage in the different countries who lack of children who lack at least 3 of these items. And what you can see here is that Albania is by far the worst country for a child to live in this respect, with around 60% of children being materially deprived. But you also see a lot of southeastern European countries having 30 to 40% of children in this situation. We see that the Nordic countries do really well in this respect, but we still, as I said before, we have to think in absolute terms here as well. So 5% is good in an international perspective. So the Nordic countries have around 5% of kids lacking at least 3 of these items. And that might sound a little, but 5% is still more than 1 child in each classroom, for example. So it's not negligible. It's still a decent number of children that we should be concerned with. Even though it's better than Albania and Romania, for example, it's not 0. And here is something interesting. So the numbers just came in a couple of days ago from the 2024 survey from some countries, not all countries yet. And we see something very interesting here, that the orange bars are lower than the blue bars. And what does that mean? That means, in the top of the graph, I should say. So that means that in the countries that did worst in 2021, we have seen an improvement. So fewer children suffer from material deprivation. But if we look down in the graph, we see the opposite. So in the countries like the Nordics, where children did best, we see an increase in deprivation. And this is, of course, not surprising because we've had a huge cost of living crisis. We've had price increases in these countries. So we're not surprised to see this, and it's very consistent across these richer countries. One exception is actually Norway. I don't know why, because they look like the others when you look at adult material deprivation. But we see, and here I've just enlarged the part with the Nordic countries, so we see an increase in child material deprivation during the last 3 years in the Nordic countries. Yeah, so now we've gone through the direct income measures. So we've gone through material deprivation, financial deprivation on the household level and on the child level. So now I will go to the indirect poverty measures. And here we usually use incomes. So in principle, you could use assets or wealth and things like that, but that is very unusual. So what we see reported in terms of indirect poverty measures are almost always based on incomes. So first, we use absolute, so-called absolute income poverty, and it's absolute in the sense that it measures if you can afford a given basket of goods. So do you have, or your household have, a disposable income that is enough for this basket? And then if prices increase, you maintain the same basket, so then more money is required to buy that basket. So it adjusts for prices, but the basket can also be updated. So for example, when mobile phones became common, they can be included, and when smartphones became common, they can be included, etc. So the basket can change if what you find to be a decent living standard changes in a given society. So the basket is in that sense not absolute, but it's absolute in the sense that it's not affected by other people's incomes, which is what the next one is, and that is the relative income poverty measure, which is often called at risk of poverty. It's median-based. That means having a disposable income that is significantly below normal income levels in your country. And it's often, the limit is often set at 60% of the median. So this measure depends on both your own income and others' incomes. So if your situation improves, you can still become poor if other situations improve even more. There are some problems with these measures, which I don't have time to go into. I'll just show them briefly. And one is that they're usually reported on an annual basis. So if you're poor, for example, from June to June, that is 6 months in each calendar year, you might not be observed as poor in the data because income registers are based on calendar years. And as I said, we usually don't use information on assets and wealth, and there are also other issues involved which I don't go into now. And I will also skip this other measure that sometimes is used to measure poverty because it's a very inappropriate measure of poverty, and that is the proportion of people getting minimum income support. Because, well, basically, if the municipalities sort of squeeze and give people less support, then you will see that as a decreased poverty. So it's not really a good measure of poverty. So I will skip that one today. So we start with the relative median-based income poverty, and this is Sweden again. We look in this graph at the period from 1991 to 2023. So the income data have not been updated yet to 2024. So here at the axis at the bottom, you have time. So you have change here over time, and then in the axis going upward, you have the percentage who are relatively poor, median-based poor. And this is the full population. So if you're interested in children, the trend is the same. It's just that the curve shifts upward a bit because poverty is a bit higher in families with children. So what you see here is that we had a huge increase after the recession that Sweden had in the 90s. And that might sound strange, but it's perfectly logical because when the median incomes increase, then the poverty line also increases and more people become poorer. So now at the end of this period, you see the same thing because we have this very interesting situation that the real incomes have decreased and then the poverty line also decreases and fewer people are poor in this regard. So I just here explain this a bit better. So what you see in these two graphs, the first one shows the development of real incomes, and you see for the first time in like 25 years, Sweden had a decrease in real income, so people could afford less. So basically, in 2023, we're back at the level of 2016 in the level of living. So This is the first time this is happening, which is really, really interesting. And of course, it's really bad, but it's also interesting. And this was caused not by decreasing nominal incomes, but by an extreme increase in prices. As most of you remember, the increase in prices was huge in 2022 and also to some extent in 2023. So we see then that we know that people could afford less, and that this happened across the distribution. And we have, when that happens, we don't have an increase in relative poverty because everyone's affected. So it's not affecting the relative distance or the relative relation between people at the bottom and people in the middle. And just to emphasize that the measures say very different things. So here I just show, using the Swedish level of living survey, the degree of overlap. So what we see is that only a tenth of those in relative income poverty actually suffer from material deprivation, measured as lacking at least 3 of these items. And in fact, as much as 63% of those in relative income poverty do not lack any of these items. So they are very different measures. So relative poverty is instinctively not what many people see as poverty, but it measures inequality in the bottom of the income distribution. As such, it's really interesting, but it measures inequality. It should be called something like relatively low income or something like that. So here we go to other indirect poverty measures. So here we look also at the basket base, the absolute measure, and I've also included minimum income support here, but we should not discuss that today. Don't have time. But we see something surprising here, actually, and that's that also these absolute measures decrease during the last couple of years. And that is counter to expectations. I would have expected them to increase, given that people have had decreasing real incomes. So I would have expected these to increase. The reason, and I looked into this, and it seems that the reason that we don't see an increase in absolute poverty is that the percentage of incomes at the bottom of the income distribution that comes from wages is quite low, and the percentage coming from benefits is quite high. And benefits are actually price indexed, so that could explain this finding. But we'll have to wait a few more years to see how this develops before we can say anything definitely about this. But it's a really interesting pattern, really, given what we've seen about deprivation. And yes, this is something close to my heart. So when we measure poverty, we usually measure it as family poverty, family-based poverty, either family deprivation or based on family income. But this is a problem because resources are not always distributed equally within a family. There are power issues involved here. So we need to look at both the individual and the family's resources. So not only like the man and the woman or the 2 persons that are adults in the household, but also children and youth. And in order to do that, we use National Representative Service of Children. And these surveys are connected to the parental service. So in the level of living survey, we also do a child level of living survey with the children in the household. And we have various ways of measuring their economic situation. And the children are 10 to 18, I should say. The younger children are very hard to study, even though we would wish to ask them questions as well. It's very hard to approach them with surveys. And here I'll show some trends here. So first we ask these kids whether they have a cash margin, whether they can afford to get, and this changes also over time. Now it's 200 Swedish krona to the next day in case they wanted to go to like the cinema or have a meal with friends. And we see that increased sharply from 2000 to 2010, and then it's been stable. And then we ask kids relative poverty measures. We ask if they cannot afford to buy things that many friends buy, that often happens, and whether they cannot afford to join friends to activities, and whether that happens often, and if that is, of course, due to a lack of money. And we also measure the combination of those, whether you lack both the ability to buy things friends buy and do things with friends, and that is the red curve. And we also measure material aspects, so we don't show all of them here, but we show not having our own room, which has been measured since 2000, it has been going down, so fewer kids do not have their own room. And we can see for all of these there is a downward trend, so it's getting better until 2021. Unfortunately, here we don't have this period now when we've seen price increases. We will do the next level of living survey in a few years, so we will by then be able to study whether things worsened during these last couple of years. And this also, I'll try to go through this quickly. So looking at showing why it's important to measure children's economy and not only parents' economy. So here we look at those parents who lack a cash margin. Okay, so these are only parents who lack a cash margin, and then we study how many of those kids, the kids to those parents, lack a cash margin themselves. Of course, very different sizes of cash margins, but still. So we see that 35% of the children to parents who lack cash margin also lack cash margin. So around a third of those kids do that. And we study also this for other outcomes for the children. And we see, for example, that around similar proportion, around a third, have the problem to buy things that other children buy. And the interesting thing comes when we study also the parents who don't have a cash margin. These kids would be invisible if you studied just the family poverty, but you see that substantial numbers of these kids also have economic problems. So you see that 16% of children to parents who have a cash margin, they actually lack a cash margin. These would be totally invisible if you just looked at the household level. So what this graph shows, so if you look at the parents who lack a cash margin, the bars are higher, which you would expect. So if parents are poor, the children are also at high risk of being poor at the child level. But you see that the overlap is far from perfect. The majority of the children to poor parents actually don't have problems, and that is because parents often shield their children. But you also see that parents not classified as poor according to this measure, they have kids who actually have economic problems as well. So even though the bars are not as high as for the poorer parents, there are still kids who suffer from economic problems, which we wouldn't see if we didn't ask them ourselves. Yeah, I'm moving now towards the end. I'll just very, very briefly mention something that's also important and seldom taken into account. It's the persistence and concentration of poverty. So poverty is often measured on an annual basis, and some people, given those measures, say that poverty has become democratized, like many people have some poverty during their lives. I find that a very strange position to take because it makes long-term poverty invisible. It's true that most people who ever become poor are short-term poor, but if you look at those who are poor in a given year, most of them are chronically poor, are long-term poor. And the important thing is the time spent in poverty. So the occasional years in poverty are not policy relevant, as policy relevant. The small group who are poor for a long time bear the most poverty experiences in the population, and this group is the one that should be mostly targeted by policy. Okay. So, summary. So different poverty measures, as I've shown, measure different things and show different trends. And it's very important to keep this in mind when we see poverty figures, that what kind of poverty measure is this and what does it and does it not tell us. So we need consistent measurements with good validity. So, for example, we need measures, so-called absolute measures that would be validated with some kind of budget standard that consistently sets a limit that is deemed to be a respectful living standard over time. We also need measures of deprivation. For example, we could see that very clearly now that the cost of living crisis that we've had was clearly visible in deprivation, but not in income measures. And we also need to have different names for different measures. So it's good to have different measures, and we need them all, but we need to call them different things so that we don't confuse people. And we need to measure poverty at both the family and the individual levels, and especially we need reports from children themselves. And empirically, we see an important trend break, a very interesting trend break. We see this increased material deprivation that we would expect during the last few years, but we don't see this reflected in income-based poverty measures. And looking in an international perspective, the deprivation level in the Nordics, the direct measures of poverty still are very low in international perspective, but we must remember that it's not negligible. So having 5% poor children in the deprivation respect is is still not a good level. A small group of long-term poor people dominate the number of years of poverty, and that is the most policy-relevant group to focus on. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers of today's webinar. We have had some really insightful speaks here today from Tone Fløtten and Karina Mod. They have given us some good insights into the challenges of measuring child poverty in the Nordic region and the limitations of some of the measures that are in use. Maria and Debora gave us insight into our first findings for the report that is coming this fall. Now, I would like you to say hello to Kaisa Kepsu, my colleague from our Finnish office. She is the lead project manager of the integration project, and we cooperate. Because I work on children and youth and you on integration, we have several cooperations. Welcome to our today's webinar.
Thank you. It's been a joy to collaborate and also hearing this important webinar. We are in the integration project. We are working to help stakeholders in the Nordic countries develop policies and initiatives towards more effective integration so that all groups can have possibilities to become part of society. And this has been really important, the topic of today. And we have several projects overlapping this topic. We have, for example, recently published a report on how the Nordic countries are promoting labor market integration among migrant parents in particular, what is working and what is perhaps working a little bit less well. Mm-hmm. We have also looked at educational results for children and youth with foreign background, and we see, for example, boys falling behind a bit, and that's also a risk of exclusion. And we have also looked at, for example, the role of a preschool and the important role for integration for children and youth, but also the whole family in preschool. Mm. So we have we have been working before together, and it's also the joy to do it right now.
Mm-hmm. And some of your reports we can really recommend it because they also give some really good insights on how the Nordic region can learn from each other on what kind of measures that aids children and families who are newly arrived to the Nordic region.
Then now I'm curious, what do you think were the key takeaways from today's webinar?
Oh, it's a challenging question because it was quite a lot, wasn't it? I think perhaps, as you said, that we see that it's a huge proportion of the migrant and refugee families that are vulnerable. I think that's something that we need to be aware of when we work on this project. I think also the proportion of single-parent household that it's that they are so vulnerable, and perhaps we need to look into measures on how to aid these families, especially now that we see that the cost levels in the Nordic region is going up. Also, the geographical disparities, I think, is interesting, both the rural areas. We would like to go into that, and we have discussed that with Nordregio. That would be really interesting to go into. I think there's really a need to look into longitudinal cross-national research on the well-being of children and youth in the Nordic region to get some indicators that we can compare and also to measure and follow it over time and to discuss what kind of political measures are working in Sweden and not in Denmark or in Norway and so forth. Yeah. That would be really interesting. And we hope that this report can push us forward in that kind of cooperation. And especially, I think, when we also see the increase of youth criminality in the Nordic region, I think that could also be good. So the next steps of the report. Should we talk about that?
Yeah, what is happening next in the project?
First of all, we will be at Almedalsvecka discussing this report. So follow us on our web. But we also are collaborating with Tone Fløtten. She will gather what we know about research on the well-being of children and youth in the Nordic region, and also to gather some research on how are the children doing. As Karina Mood said, we don't really see all the children's well-being and how they fare in the data, especially not with AROP, which is sort of a limited measure. So that will be really interesting. But we are also going to look into what kind of measures are in place in the Nordic region. What measures are in use with aiming to promote social mobility.
In the different countries, what they are doing in the different countries.
And what we suspect is that some of the measures that are aiming to give social mobility and social inclusion perhaps aren't targeted enough. So we hope to look into some of those measures.
That would be really interesting.
For instance, quality of kindergartens and school, and how we can strengthen leisure activities and social inclusion activities to give children and youth mastery and social inclusion. But also perhaps what we do around housing conditions in perhaps the larger cities. And also strengthening employment inclusion for youth, I think, will be really interesting. And parents, as you are mentioning. So
be on the lookout for that.
Follow us on this report, and follow also on us on the website, and follow our updates. We will be inviting to a new webinar in the fall when the report is finalized. Now we would like to thank you for following us today, and also for all of you that have been discussing in the chat today. And anything else we should say, Kaisa?
Thank you, and until next time.
Yeah, good to have you with us. Bye-bye.
Bye.